Diplomatic efforts in the Middle East and beyond. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce. Tammy, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
I want to pick up where Steve just left off in these discussions with Gaza, the president saying, hey, maybe in the next week there could be a peace agreement. How realistic is that?
Well, very realistic. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we see that's happening. The importance of what's happened with Iran and how that has changed the Middle East forever due to the president's leadership and his willingness to deliver when it comes to changing people's lives for the better and making sure Iran can't have and will never have a nuclear weapon. When it comes to a peace agreement, that has never stopped. Those conversations, those negotiations, the commitment to that region has been foremost on President Trump's mind. He has stated it clearly that there's got to be a new idea, a new way to move forward, that the carnage that has continued for generations has got to stop. But the only way it's going to stop is for the region to be involved, but for these new ideas to come forward. Now, clearly, the Middle East has changed forever due to President Trump's leadership. And at the same time now, you've got discussions with individuals who've up to now broke ceasefires. They are the reasons why this has been a problem in the Gaza Strip. But I think it's safe to say that perhaps Hamas and everyone else who's relied on Iran realize that the gig is up. And it is now an opportunity to release the hostages and the bodies of those that they've continued to hold, to put down those weapons so that the first victims of Hamas and this kind of terrorism, the people of Gaza, have a chance to live their lives in peace and with a view to the future.
Essentially, what we're talking about here is a capitulation by Hamas. I mean, is there a sense that they're actually going to do that and possibly leave the Gaza Strip? Well,
Secretary Marco Rubio has made clear that nothing can move forward and Gaza will not be safe and there will not be peace as long as Hamas exists. That is one basic standard. This kind of a cancer can't continue. And that is recognized now. And it's recognized that the world can change for the people in the Gaza Strip who felt, well, this is just will always be our lives, have found out, oh, no, Donald Trump changes the future for people, makes it something that you can imagine for the betterment of yourself and the family. So I think that you're looking at the reality of the situation, the fact that their benefactors now perhaps are not or in a shambles effectively at this point when it comes to Iran, and that it is time for a new age for everyone in that region, everyone's lives to be better. So the Middle East, I think also with the work of Qatar, which has been remarkable in helping to make some of these negotiations and, of course, the end result feasible, makes it, of course, better for everyone.
The president says the U.S. and Iranian officials will be meeting this upcoming week. What can you tell us about where, with whom?
Oh, I can't say anything about that. But I can tell you that, obviously, there has to be now a move forward. The president's vision was about making sure that Iran would not have a nuclear weapon. The fact is that entire infrastructure is a shambles. When they claim that they won the war, what they are still that they're going to rebuild their nuclear capacity. The fact is they need to figure out how to get out of their cave first and then maybe rebuild the regular living kind of quality of life for the Iranians. The good news is that the future of Iran is in the hands of the Iranian people. And they also now have a chance. But there has to be a conversation now about how to change the trajectory of Iran now that the president's goal was established and accomplished. And that's a very exciting time for all of us, I think, in the world.
We've seen some of the old trajectory. The Iranian regime is cracking down on its people. How does the U.S. support the Iranian people?
Well, I think that ultimately, again, the future of every nation is in the hands of its own people. At this point, America, and certainly through President Trump's vision, believes that diplomacy, talking with people is what makes the difference. And that's the case here, that he will do what is needed to make sure that we can achieve a peace dynamic for the future that is enduring, not for 6 months or a year, not that we just keep going through the same steps. So I think that what we're seeing is the result of extensive peace efforts through diplomacy. We see it through Secretary Rubio's efforts around the world, and that will, I think, inspire people, not just in the Middle East in general, but around the world, realizing that the individual matters, that they can take their nations back, that the regular people matter. So I think it's going to be about inspiration, and the Iranian people who have stated before, of course, that they would like some change. Now perhaps is their opportunity. But for us, it's making sure that Iran can move forward in a peaceful way without the trajectory and the attitude they've had and being the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. That, of course, I think is going to have to end.
The president said that he had a good meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He said to President Putin, apparently, that he could use a little more help in Ukraine, not in Iran. Where's the United States in ending that conflict?
Well, you know, we have been Ukraine's biggest supporter. We've been the most vocal, certainly. We've assisted them in and led the nature of the summits and the peace talks. President Trump has gotten everyone in these regions to the table. Of course, Russia and Ukraine, and when it came to Iran, Iran's been at the table. So that's an important indicator of the seriousness with which people take the President of the United States. At the same time, when you mention Israel and the Gaza Strip, we've seen that peace movement work forward, looking for, of course, a ceasefire there. But for Putin, the President made an interesting remark that Putin had noted to the president that he would be willing to help with Iran. And the president said, he told him, I don't need help with Iran. I need help with you. That this is about Ukraine, the nature of how many people are still dying, and that carnage has to stop, is not winnable militarily. We remain engaged with that for our Ukrainian friends and for the Russians also who are suffering. Everyone in the world is suffering. This is a multi-country front. Many countries are facilitating that carnage. The president and the secretary have noted that. So our diplomacy continues. Obviously, the talks continue, and that we're certainly as focused on that as we ever have been.
Tammy Bruce, State Department spokesperson, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.